I'm really delighted to introduce Marie Battiste as our keynote speaker for the day. We're very privileged to have her here. She is not only one of the most prominent Indigenous academics from Canada, but also one of the most prominent commentators on Indigenous culture in Canada. And she is full professor in the Department of Educational Foundations at the University of Saskatchewan, and you can read of her many accomplishments. I won't go through the whole list, but a long series of very important books on Indigenous culture in Canada. She has degrees from Harvard and Stanford, but even more remarkably, she has degrees that she didn't have to do any extra work for because universities are lining up to give her honorary degrees. So it's always a signal of remarkable achievements when universities are kind of asking you if they can give you a doctorate. And so we're very pleased to have Marie Battiste with us today, and she's going to deliver, I think, a very challenging message about some of the obstacles and possibilities facing the church and Indigenous peoples' efforts at reconciliation. We have about an hour and a half for this session, and I think for the sake of the simultaneous translation, Marie said that she was going to speak a little more slowly, so she will speak for about an hour, and then we should have about a half hour for question and answers after that. So if you would please join me in welcoming Marie Battiste.
Tansay, Adawalopio, Agasi, Kujidayo, Avagasi, Lamuno, Ekimi Jiku, Det, Low Foxton, Vagasia, Valario, Musican. I wanted just to open with a comment to say I'm very happy to be here today, and I thank the organizers for inviting me here today. I have a task which is very difficult. One is because I got a cold, and so I've got a lot of this happening, and two is I have to talk a bit slowly. And that is another hard thing for me to do. So I'm going to try to keep in mind that. But I recognize that when I get excited, I go quite the other way. I would like to, first of all, start off by recognizing our protocols of place. In Canada and throughout all the institutions, we are now moving toward all the universities and colleges, high schools, and every organization to open their whatever classes, their conferences, and so on, in recognition of the Indigenous peoples of the place. And to understand that I am part of the Potawatomi. It's not as loud as, because my voice is so So in our universities, we are taught that this isn't, not taught, but that we are teaching the universities how to indigenize the academy. And part of that is the recognition of the lands on which they are located. In this place, I'm sorry that I didn't have a wide breadth of the United States as well, but it shows you at least how in Canada all of our lands are Indigenous lands, and all of those lands are pretty much on treaty territories. The Potawatomi are here in this particular territory, and we recognize that we have a responsibility to the people of a particular place. We acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the territory as we recognize them as the owners and the stewards often the prayer leaders and take carers of those particular lands. And it is a way that we show respect for the First Peoples of the territory. It acknowledges respect and relationship, a reciprocity of being on the land, as well as a notion of reverence in that particular territory. It also makes an important statement about the visibility, or the lack of visibility, how we as Indigenous people have been invisible on our own lands. And we have been invisible on our lands, so much so that most universities, places of instruction, have no idea on whose land they are located and what responsibilities that they have to those particular places. And so this is an important way to make visible Aboriginal people, Indigenous people who've been silenced, invisible, marginalized, and yet are the original owners and caretakers of that ecology, that land, and that territory. I wanted to start off, first of all, by telling you a little bit about my people, my place. This is my family, and this is me, the youngest of this family. And I put it in the forefront where we lived in Holton, Maine. As my family left the reserve before I was born, and it was during the time of centralization. The federal government decided to move all our people off their self-sustaining lands, farms, and move them onto the reserve, where they promised them education and health. They promised them a new house, schools, a new church. They promised them a way of life, jobs. And during that time, my parents had a very difficult time making a decision to leave. But one of the reasons why my father left the reserve was because he had a mastoid behind his ear, which would have caused him death. And he needed to have medical attention, and he needed it close to where we lived. So my family went to Nova Scotia, or to the reserve in Eskasoni, where they were required to live with several families in one house. Other people had to live in tents outside, or to build birch bark housing in which they lived in until their housing was completed. In all those instances, those houses were built but with no interior in them. And the people lived in those houses for anywhere from 15 to 20 years before the interiors were put, including the insulation and the floorboards. And so in 1947, my father left that community and said, I'm going to go work in the potato industry to get some money to pay off bills. And my mother, who had just had my sister, a newborn, said, you're not leaving me, I'm coming with you. I know what happens in those camps, and I'm staying with you. So they went to Maine, and on the way to Maine, they dropped off my older sister, who was then of school age, at the Indian residential school. And there, my sister stayed for 3 years, until my parents could get enough money in order to be able to come and get her and find a place to live where they could have her go to school and be on a bus line and not be in the tar paper shack behind the potato house in Maine. So my personal location is I was raised in the United States. I am a member of the Micmac band of Micmacs in Maine, Holton, Maine, which is now a federally recognized tribe in the United States. And I'm also a Treaty First Nation in Canada, living from the reserve of Bundle Deck, where my family came from. So I was raised in the United States, and this is the cause of my wonderful English language that I have. and probably even my main accent that goes with it. And I was raised within a very Catholic religious tradition. My family, and I'll tell you a bit about our history of Catholicism in just a minute, but that kind of tradition kept me and kept me going through teaching that to my children until they got to high school age, when I had to confront their questions about why we were continuing this, because I was teaching in anti-racist and anti-oppressive education, and every time we went to church, the priest would carry on about homosexuality and all the issues around that. And every day we came home from the church, I would have to tell my kids, that's not what we believe, and they said, well, why are we going? And I said, okay, it's now your turn, you're done, I'm done, you take on your own spirituality in your own way, and I'll take on mine. And we will no longer do whatever it is that our parents did until such time as we find our way back to that. So, as part of my life, I've been I moved back and around through the United States, California, and also in Maine. But I also have been a principal and an educator on my own First Nation community in Baudelaire. I was after I got my doctorate degree, I went back and opened up a bilingual bicultural education program on the reserve in Baudelaire, from which I then began to raise my kids on the reserve in their language, and also we remained there for some time until I then went on to become a professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Mi'kmaq Catholicism is something that we've had at least since 1610. Unlike the tribes in most places that have been under Christianity for less than 100 years, especially in the prairies, our Mi'kmaq people first met Cabot and all of those French explorers very early, and they brought with them their missionaries, who they deposited among ourselves, and then went on and picked up our people, who taught them how to live throughout our territories. And so we've had a very long period of Catholicism. In 1610, Chief Member 2 of the Mi'kmaq Nation was baptized with 20 members of his family. And from that time, we as Mi'kmaq people have held a Catholicism as a basis of our spirituality. But that spirituality is something that is then compromised over time. Primarily that when the early missionaries came in, they baptized, they talked a little bit, but basically there was no changing of who we were, because they couldn't speak the language, we couldn't speak their language. But over time they learned our language, and they learned how to teach their language to other missionaries who came through. And so we've had a relationship with the church, with the Holy Roman Empire, that is written in a book called the Concordat, that my husband, Sage Youngblood Henderson, has written a theory about the Wabanaki Confederacy and this wampum belt, which was in the Roman archives of the Holy Roman Empire, or in the Vatican, which was then put away during a time in 1968 when there was some kind of uprising there. And then we went to look for it, and we couldn't find it. And each time we wrote to the Vatican, they said, we don't have it. We don't know what you're talking about. It's not here. And so we had skip ahead now 10 years, or 15, 20 years. They have now found that. And we have seen it, and we have reviewed it, and we acknowledge it does belong to us. And we know it belongs to us because we have a tradition that goes with it. We have a story that is in it. And it is a story that's being passed on through our traditional chiefs. So we know that part of it. When you look at these symbols, these are symbols that were created in the interim between our Indigenous Algonquian literacy traditions and Roman script writing. This is a prayer of, in Mi'kmaq, this is the Our Father. It starts with, Luchinin waso kevin, Jiptuk television negative nekwaso lidana. Jiptuk iginumuyak wala namulak waledas and nadia waso keki. Deliskaraski, Jiptuk elpnin and deliskamak maumik again. Delamu benesmia at Lapshni, Yagisko, Klamatich, Mediginum, and Deliapic side, Diktaji, Rainak to make help deal, Miskam, Kia, Big Situin. Anyway, with the movement and measure would see the water garland, yes, no one for which will go wedge to line. That is a prayer that my mother taught me. This is how she has come to know from a tradition from 400 years of the people keeping a prayer and keeping it in their language and then keeping that moving on. And this is a part of the part of the hieroglyphic script writing that a missionary said he developed, when in fact he watched children marking on with coal on birch bark these symbols, and then he copied it and said, I discovered it. 20, 30 years later, another missionary came by, did the same thing, and my yard said he discovered it. But anyway, in our particular territory, we had, as all of those settlements of missionaries and others started to come in, we had a relationship with the French, and that was a pretty good relationship. And then the British came, and they had war with the French, and then as a result, they began to war with us. But we settled up because we were still more numerous than they, and they settled up with a treaty. So from 1725 into 1779, we've had several treaties that have been done that promised Mi'kmaq people the freedom of our own Mi'kmaq Catholicism, because we had already had that which was given that we had settled up into since 1610. And they tried to make us Protestants, but we refused. And so in the treaty, it is acknowledged that we could have our own freedom of our own tradition and Mi'kmaq Catholicism and our own livelihood, and that they would and regulate the missionaries. It also set out for the principles for how settlers would get land. Settlers would have to buy the land from the people, and they would have to purchase that territory. That it comes about as in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the king reserves unceded, unpurchased Aboriginal lands in Atlantic provinces and the West as Indian country and Northwest Territory as federal territories. Eventually they gave all that land away, sold off major parcels of it, but our land is still unceded lands, unpurchased lands that still belong to those people, to the Indigenous people of the territory. And as soon as I get the lottery, I'm going to then take this to the comprehensive claims, because we had that ready to go to comprehensive claims when in the BC group chiefs wanted to take their claims forward, and the people said, let them go first, test that water. If they get it, then we'll go for it. In the meantime, Indian Affairs made it ever impossible for our management of our government to continue to hold on to any funds that would enable us to be able to take them to court. So we have under those treaties and those proclamations the constitutional principles that creates Canada. Canada does not become Canada without treaties. Canada does not become Canada as a settlement that they came in and warred some group and took over the land. They are only Canada because they have an agreement with the Indigenous people in those lands to be Canada. So we allowed them to have their own settlements, to have their own governments in a self-determining way. We allowed them to have their own church, their own education, but we were granted and full permission to have our own and to keep our own. That then was affirmed in our Catholicism, where it said that the Indians shall not be molested in the exercise of their religion, provided the missionaries residing amongst them have leave from their governor or commander-in-chief of His Majesty said province of Nova Scotia or Acadia for so doing. 1978, the British expelled all the French priests, expelled all the French from Acadia, leaving Abbé Maillard, who was the priest who was living among us and who spoke Mi'kmaq. And they left him to minister to us in such a way as to deliver the messages from the British to us. So he had to remain loyal to the British in all of those kinds of things. So when they had him translate the treaties, the Mi'kmaq said to him, why don't you translate like we tell you to? And he said, I have to be loyal to the king. And so Abbé Maillard continued to live among the Mi'kmaq even after all the French were sent away. And he died in 1762 with the British sent over a Protestant minister to be with him on his deathbed. And on his deathbed, even at the point of when he died signing the sign of the cross, this minister, Reverend Wood, was said to have then said that Maillard said to him that he now takes over from Maillard. And so he attempted to do so, doing all the prayers in Mi'kmaq that he had learned from Maillard and doing the sign of the cross and so on. But the Mi'kmaq were not stooped by that kind of thing and remained in their own form and kept for over 100 years a spirituality that was built without priests. Without any of them, they read their prayers, they continued to live the life that they had lived as Mi'kmaq people deep in their spiritual traditions. And and it was not until those priests came back that we then had a new focus on education. And that was around, the treaty education began in the West with the chiefs who said, our hands are poor, but our heads are rich, and it is the riches that we ask so that we may be able to support our families as long as the sun rises and the water runs. And so this treaty education that Mi'kmaq people saw that the need was for them to learn how to adjust to some new changes that they were going through, and in so doing needed to learn many of the new tools that were coming in. So in the treaties across Canada, the government made treaties with all the rest of them across and said, Her Majesty agrees to maintain schools for instruction as to a government of the Dominion of Canada may seem advisable, and whenever the Indians of the Reserve shall desire it. They also said that this provisions of treaty education, which were each one in different places, was when they desire it, when the Queen thinks it is advisable to do so, and all when a school is built. So there was all kinds of conditions around them, but they were similar to this. But in so doing, it creates the honor of the crown. So the honor of the crown is that the crown, through the British King, who then gives to the Canada the right to continue those treaties in relationship, it is that honor of the crown that's passed on into the education domain, And it is their fiduciary relationship obligation to provide education, health, and all kinds of other things to which are embedded within those particular treaties. So education, socialization, and transmission of sustainable holistic learning was maintained within the family. So while a school was built, it didn't say you had to go to it, it said you could go to it. And in many instances, right up and through 1842, we see Commissioner saying, they do come, but they don't stay long. They do come and they do well, but basically they go with the seasons into where they have to go, into their camps, where they camp and where their whole life is around the land and the food and where the food will be gotten and so on. So education then becomes the family responsibility and is taken on. But from the time of 1870, when the British Crown entered into these treaties, and then into moving settlers all across Canada and taking and giving away our land, as in homesteading and other kinds of things, they just gave the land away, that it began this whole forced Indian residential schools. And this is a map that'll show you where all those schools were. There are over 100 schools and over 150,000 known survivors that have come from those schools, and at least we know of at least 30,000 of those students who died either in the school or immediately after they came home from those schools. So this is a forced attendance at Indian residential schools, which was built upon a false notion of the superiority of British knowledge and British cultures and British religions and so on. And we have now, as a result of that, have got lost knowledge, skills, groundedness in our family, language, community, culture, and so on, and our spirituality. And it has generated a nihilism, an emptiness, a meaninglessness that is represented in a vast amount of suicides across the country. It is a part of the drug addictions and other kinds of things when people are totally there's no meaning left in their lives. When the parents' lives were taken away, when their children were removed, they had nothing but to remain in those houses with the silence in the community could be heard. So this kind of thing has continued on, and that we'd like, one of the things that that a lot of people over the years, in looking at the situation of Indigenous people, have offered many ways about why that is the case. And so Eurocentrism is what when we look at all that colonialization, Eurocentrism rationalized the subjugation of not only Indigenous peoples, but Black Africans, Native Americans, using the God frame and nature frame. In other words, God didn't come to these people. They didn't have God. Therefore, some other person who had God must bring it to them. Or that the nature frame was they just lived in nature. They were, children of the forest, and therefore we needed to bring them God into their lives. So the colonialists viewed themselves as complying with these divine forces. And for many centuries, the Indigenous people have suffered the wrath of churches, of the whole Eurocentric colonial paradigm onto them that created overlapping dispositional stereotypes of savages, of warriors, of sexualized women, of various kinds of forms of being wards, children of the state, and all kinds of other things that justify their actions, the paternalism and the policies that continue. And so it was in the 18th, 19th century, they used the concept of race as a natural frame to excuse their actions on the basis of racial superiority and justify the racial inferiority of Indigenous victims and slaves of their suffering. So today, when we think about racialization, it is that race doesn't exist as we now understand by by many learned United Nations people have told us that. Race does not exist, racialization does, racism does. There is no such thing, I'm afraid to say, as a red man, a yellow man, a black man, and a white man, and we reject that notion because that's essentializing racism in the very nature of that particular assertion. Those frames, the God frame, the devil frame, this frame, the unjust outcomes were justified by the presence or the absence of God's grace, will, and plan, menacingly the possessive influence of the devil. In our language, our what we called God was Mindu. And when the priest came, they then changed that to the devil. And now today, when we say Mindu Alaviye, we always use that word, it means go to hell. And so there's the evolution nature biology schema that does the same. Unjust outcomes are dictated not by the divine, only by the divine, but also by their certain genes or inherited qualities, their small head, their small brain, the color of their skin, any number of things justify that. And then the other one was the market, personality, character-based, which is the one that's used so frequently today, that people are in jail because of their bad character. Not because of the poverty they live, not because of the residential school horror that they've had to live with, not because of the kind of violence that has been portrayed upon them and thus they continue themselves, but because of their character. And their character has been used as the way in which the courts continue to put our Indigenous people in jail. The other frames are the traditional frame. Unjust outcomes reflect by the extent to which individuals or groups or comply with or deviate from historical lessons, from practices and values that are leading or led in some prior golden age to progress and idealized behavior. In other words, there's this progression of hierarchy progression, the evolution. There's those that are still stuck in the evolutionary primitive level. They haven't moved on to move on. So then there's the normalcy frame. Well, they aren't normal. They haven't got a healthy disposition. They've been at residential schools. They've suffered trauma. They are in a healthy lot. So what happens is that all of the kinds of ways in which we to correct that is by saying, let's have more healing. They need healing. They are not the only ones need healing. It is all of those who have perpetuated the violence on them and continue to perpetuate the violence on them in the contemporary sense. They are the ones who need healing, but they need to also be slapped around for a few times too, just to make it even. The other thing is the cultural leader schema, the culture frame, that the unjust outcomes reflected by the merits of the group's presumed basic shared disposition. This disposition is one that is the one that, this is the way they are. We can't change it. This is the way they are. And so what we need to do is, live with it or, adjust to that, because that's the way they are. So for over a century or more, I would say, many centuries, the central goals of Christianity and Canada together, government and church, have conspired to eliminate Indigenous knowledge systems, our own spirituality, our own discourses about how we heal from within, how we come to find our inner sense, and taking it through and taking away our languages through the educational system. It ignored the Aboriginal treaty rights that was protected by the imperial law of Great Britain, including that very notion that we have a freedom of religion. They ignored that, as well as ignored the fact that the king said, you must purchase the land. You cannot just take the land, you have to purchase the land, said 1762 in the proclamation. So all of Nova Scotia, all of the whole Atlantic provinces are all unceded, unpurchased lands. There are only a few, which I would say less than, a very small number of lands that have been actually purchased, and there are some of those that are around the Ontario region. And so through a process of assimilation, it has been to cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. And the establishment and operation of Indian residential schools and the sponsored day schools, which are also that they did, were a central element that has now been identified as cultural genocide. Duncan Campbell Scott in 1920 said, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question, no Indian department, and that is the whole object of this bill." And that, my friend, continues to be the sole objective in our country, with some new changes. I'll get there. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out and over a period of 6 years did their research. They said that the Indian residential schools constitute an assault on Aboriginal children, on Aboriginal families, on Aboriginal culture, on self-governing and self-sustaining Aboriginal nations. The impacts of the residential school were immediate and have been ongoing since the earliest years of the schools. And Canadians throughout, and Americans and the world, have been denied a full and proper education as to the nature of Aboriginal societies, the real one, the actual one, as well as the history of the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. And this is what I say. That we have been marinated in Eurocentrism. There's nobody, almost no elder you can find, no child, nobody in the world that has not had their marination in Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is if you look at it from the idea of James Blount, a geographer, a post-colonial geographer, who talks about that Eurocentrism is a center characterized by superiority and progress. It has all the things that everybody needs, and it then sends it out to all the periphery. And in so doing, it sends out its religion, it sends out its economy, it sends out its language, it sends out its books, it sends out its universities. You can't find a university around the world that doesn't quite look like one that comes straight out of England. And they pride themselves on this England-looking university. And in all of that is a monopoly. A monopoly is a hegemony over all other knowledge systems. Today, when we ask the question, what is Indigenous knowledge, no one knows. In 1997, Indian Affairs asked myself and a group of us researchers if we would do a lit review on Indigenous knowledge. Really? That we're going to go to an anthropologist to ask what is Indigenous knowledge? Are we going to go to a linguist to ask what is Indigenous knowledge? Is there a historian that has captured what Indigenous knowledge is? And so we have lost, that whole knowledge system that we carry is still within our heads and our heart and in our land and our place in that land. It is everything that we have been and done and continue to do. And it is through the language, through the tools of our language, that we're able to capture what it is to us. So we've been forced into this assimilation, cultural genocide. It destroyed our structures, our practices. It eroded others, and had done the very thing that Duncan Campbell sought to do, to destroy us as a distinct people. And it seized our land, and it forced populations onto our reserves, and it forced us into living off the subsidy and ways of food that has never nourished our bodies or our spirits. It's built on a lot of flour and a lot of things that have helped people to develop a lot of diseases over time. It has banned our languages, and it has not done anything to restore them. It has persecuted people and leaders for their spirituality and confiscated and destroyed objects of spiritual value, put them in museums, and then had us come and look at them. Just last week, I was at a place where they brought out our sacred pipes to a conference in New Brunswick, where they opened them up and let us look at them and take a picture of it. And then they took them and put them back in the museum. So we are continuing to live the outcomes of cognitive imperialism and genocide that's left us with all kinds of various social outcomes such as these. It has led us to be ranked in, when we look at the health wellness index in Canada, or in Canada is ranked in the 6th to the 8th of the UN Human Development Index. But our First Nations fall between 63rd and 78th. My mother died in 1997, and for all the years from 1973 to 1997, she never drank the water in her community. Today, my community is under boil water watches, and they cannot even bathe in the water. That our water comes out of the tap black. They say it's magnesium, and it's harmless. But yet, my sister lives with boils on her body because she tries to wash herself, and each day has that as a problem that comes from the water. So when we look at the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, we have various articles to which we have asked that all the institutions, all the governments to accept. Now, when they did accept it, 4 of the governments across the world did not. US and Canada and New Zealand and Australia did not accept it. But eventually, over the course of time, they have so done so. You must read it. But nonetheless, Article 11 says Indigenous people have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as the archaeological, historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. And states shall provide redress through effective mechanisms which may include restitution, developed in conjunction with Indigenous people with respect to their cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. We would like to have our pipes back, don't you? But there's been change. And I guess, you have to say there is change, but we are so far yet from major change. Some of those changes have come from the Indigenous Renaissance. Some call it resurgence. The Indigenous Renaissance back in the 70s, was happening all across the world. It happened in the South, it happened in the North, It's happened all through the time when the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People was being forged. It was part of the development of the Declaration. I was part of that going to Geneva during those early years. And we had 5-minute interventions and, you know, all kinds of things. But what we did in the back and together in our little tables was to convene ourselves about our aspirations and our hopes and our dreams. And as a result of that, all the peoples around the world have joined in this resurgence, in this renaissance. And that it is both scholars and leaders and researchers and activists, and they're all leading a discourse around respect for research and decolonization practices that honor self-determination and Indigenous knowledges and communities for healing, trauma, and building well-being. It is that we have to recognize that of all the institutions we go to, no matter what one we attend to, we have not got yet a privileged education that gives us the knowledge of how to achieve a decolonized state, how to develop a decolonized religion, how to develop a decolonized education, how to decolonize our health services. So what we are doing, like you heard before, was we are dialoguing with ourselves, finding out what it is that we still have within our Indigenous traditions, from which we can then build from now in the situation and the context of which we live, which is exactly what you talked about in your work. It is that we are all victims and beneficiaries of the same system, and we have to recognize that what you've been a beneficiary of has been a Eurocentric education, but you also have been denied, and you are a victim of not having any other education but that, and so you have a deficit in education. And so we are all critical learners and healers within a wounded space, and we must move toward decolonization in an engaged space, in an engaged dialogue with Indigenous people in the survival of the diversity of Indigenous knowledges, languages, capacity, holistic spiritual and learning practices as they come to their own awareness. The core tools are these: our treaties, our elders, our spirituality, our learning to live in sustainable living, our space, our heritage, our sciences, our humanities, and most of all, our own learning spirit. That deep inside of each and every one of us, we have a purpose and a place for being in this world. And that is the kind of thing that each of us must find. It is not to be part of the economic neoliberal enterprise of capitalist economy. That is what most universities want us to think we're doing, that we're going to put the people through. They're an Indigenous person, check the box, get them through, check the box when they leave, and we have a success. No, you don't. You have now put everything on the shoulders of those individuals, and you offer them nothing to build their economy, to build their spirituality, to build their education, to build their well-being, to build their families, to build their mothers and fathers and children and women. You've done nothing to do that. And you wonder why our kids are not going back to the reserve to get, to bring that back into those communities, because basically a lot of that don't fit. And the other thing is there's no jobs. My daughter has a master's degree in the College of Medicine, living in my reserve community, doing entrepreneurial beadwork as a way to live, because there is no way that she can use the skills in community health and epidemiology for which she was trained in. So the Constitution of Canada has at least affirmed that Aboriginal treaty rights are part of the construction of Canada, and that it recognizes and it has said from the very beginning, treaties are the basis of Canada, and when it came to the Constitution in 1982, they said, we affirm Aboriginal treaty rights. And so now this is the post-colonial era. This is the time when we must move beyond the colonial era to a post-colonial era of change, when all of those affirmations of Aboriginal and treaty rights must be put into our education, into our systems of knowing, into our spirituality and well-being. And the court, the Supreme Court of Canada, in the case of R.V. Cote in 1996, said that where there is an Aboriginal right, there is a corresponding right to teach that right. In other words, we have rights, and they must be part of the education system. And not only just part of the education system because we're all treaty people, everybody must have and know what that is. So when we look at this notion of reconciliation, in which TRC said it includes anyone with an open heart and an open mind, and who is willing to look to the future in a new way. Well, there's other ways to look at it too. And some of the ones like Nelson Mandela said it means working together to correct the legacy of past injustice. And Justice Murray Sinclair of TRC said it's about ensuring that everything we do today is aimed at a high standard of restoring balance in the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And the chief, who was one of the survivors in the TRC and an honorary witness, said it is to weave a stronger and more vibrant social fabric based on the unique and diverse strengths of Canadians and their communities. So reconciliation then must take these steps. It must be an awareness from the head of the heart, awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm. And part of that is that we need to have our institutions do a way of understanding that as in cognitive justice. It's not cognitive assimilation, it's cognitive justice. And it's balancing knowledge systems. It's recognizing that we have a right to both systems, and that all of Canada, as we've heard, can be, as well as the world, can be better off for understanding a system of knowing that connects us wholly and totally to our land, to our spirituality, to our being, to our body, to our totality of our identity, whether that identity is two-spirited, gay, lesbian, transgender, whatever we are part of the whole totality of what we were brought into this world under a God-living being. And that must be honored, recognized, and kept and held, and not shamed and developed into a violence onto them. And we must atone for the past. Even though each of us may say, I didn't have anything to do with it. My parents, they were good people. I didn't do the homesteading. I wasn't part of that. What Justice Sinclair said, he said, okay, you may say that now, but right now, today, you now know that the benefits that you have had came because of that which was given to you by the losses that were taken, the disrespect to Indigenous people. And you know that. So today, every day, from here on in, you are responsible, and you can no longer say, I had no role. I had no part. This is not my job. And then finally, we need to recognize that you have an action. And while the TRC gave 94 calls to action, it is not just 94. It is in every action we do. It's in every thought we have of an Indigenous person who walks down the street who looks like they're drunk. It is the way we look at an Indigenous woman who is standing on the street corner and we say, oh, she's a prostitute. Or the way in which we think on media, oh, in this First Nation reserve, someone was killed. And we think, oh, they're fighting among themselves. All of those thoughts, all of those individual thoughts are part of the big problem. And when we begin, we need to recognize that Pope Paul gave us a message of reconciliation. Pope Paul in 1986 came to Canada and he said, over the centuries, dear Amerindian and Inuit people, you have gradually discovered in your culture special ways of living your relationship with God and the world while remaining loyal to Jesus and to the gospel. Continue to develop these moral and spiritual values. Guard this wisdom preciously. To let it become impoverished would be to impoverish the people around you. To live the spiritual values in a new way requires on your part maturity, interiority, and the deepening of the Christian message, a concern for the dignity of the human being, and a pride in being Amerindian. Your encounter with the gospel has not only enriched you, it has enriched the church. We are well aware that this has not taken place without its difficulties and occasionally its blunders. However, you are experiences today, and the gospel does not destroy what is the best in you. I won't go on to tell you about all the other things. I'm thinking that I'm taking much too long. But I will say there are many other quotes that reaffirm these kinds of things about how important it is for Indigenous people to keep their faith and to continue to build upon them. The TRC has defined reconciliation for us, and in some of the calls to action to the church, they ask that the church, first and foremost, in the number 48, adopt the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as a framework for reconciliation. It requires in number 49 that everyone repudiate the concepts that justified European superiority and sovereignty over Indigenous lands and people, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. The land was not empty. It was never empty. You didn't discover us. And therefore, that whole notion and all the laws that came from it must be rethought in relation to what we now know today. That we need the Pope's apology, and he has given that, but it is not enough. He must then also apologize to the Indian residential school survivors, families, and communities for the harm done to them and to our families and our communities and our cultures and our lands and our future. All of those things have been the direct result of the church and what they have done. And then we need to have educational strategies so everyone knows what TRC is, everyone knows what residential schools is, everyone knows about Eurocentrism and colonialism, and everybody then can learn about what our Indigenous concepts of being have been, are, and can be for the future, and how we reconstruct our Indigenous spirituality. That your Indigenous theology is enlightening, it is superior, it is far better than I've ever heard anything, and to which I feel that at present a whole lot of my community that is walking with Catholicism today is not walking in it the right way. They still do the smudging and they do the vestments in the culture, but that is not what we are looking for as Indigenous people. We do not need to have any more white men come into our community to be Indians. We need you to be supportive to our culture, to our language. And if it means learning our language and then teaching it to all the other people, then that is a way to do it, much in the same way that those missionaries who came in those early years learned our language and learned it well, and then taught us to be everything that we do not want to be today. And those TRC calls to action continue. And they say that we have to not only teach each other, but we have to teach all clergy. All student clergy must learn this, and everyone must have that, to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right. RITE is also a good one as well, in their history, their legacy of the Indian residential school, and the roles of the church, parties in that system, and their history and legacy of religious conflict. We have number 61 is the permanent funding to Aboriginal people for healing and reconciliation. The church was supposed to provide $23 million, sent the court to the church, to Catholic Church. You have to provide $23 million reparation. At the end of all of that, they said, we gave $3 million. And the court said, you did not give $3 million. You put $3 million into your lawyers to prevent you from having to do anything more. You gave nothing. And so we need permanent funding. We need also for the churches to develop an online registry of residential school cemeteries, and that all of those parents and communities know where all those 30,000 children are today, and to allow them to take their graves and either mark them as residential school and so on and honor them, or move them back into their own communities where they can be honored in their own communities. So I'm going to pass through some of these, but I think that what we need to do is we need to have a vision of reconciliation that's personal and collective. That means that we have to, each one has to listen, contemplate, meditate on what all these things mean for each and every one of them. You have to accept and learn the colonial history of the church and how it affected your beliefs. It has to reconcile the negative views of Indigenous people and build an anti-racist and intercultural education. We need to build a safe space for Indigenous people to exist and to thrive. We need to acknowledge colonial complicities with living and being on Indigenous lands. That we bring over immigrants from other countries, we give them a racist book called Discover Canada, and have you learn that, and then you take your test on racist material, and then we wonder why immigrants who come to Canada have not a good view of us as Indigenous people. We have to understand the relationships of treaties and Aboriginal rights and the important part of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We all must learn, unlearn, and relearn. And at the collective level is important because you have to make a commitment as an organization. You can do it by yourself, but you've got an organization. You belong to a church, you belong to a group, you belong to a school, you belong to something, and you must make a commitment as an organization. You've got to examine the hidden biases in the curricula of Eurocentrism in that workplace. Building a staff or some kind of check-in to figure out how do people here understand things, and how can we help to change that, at least at this organization level. And how do we define reconciliation, and how do we move forward to develop a consensus and understanding, and thus make our personal and thus collective goals, and then monitor those goals. We have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that give us all these rights, and I'm not going to run through them. I would invite you to go online, read all of those, but to recognize that we do have certain rights for various things, and that we have an urgent need for educational and treaty reconciliation, and that the church must support, every institution must support, and we must inspire, but the churches must be inspired to understand their histories and to transform the societies that they have direct relationship and influence on. And that by doing so, we can all then live together in dignity and peace and prosperity on the lands we now share. So I ask you to educate yourselves, educate your communities, look at the issues of internalized dominance and internalized oppression that continue to live as continuing problems in our communities, and just give up this notion that we can privilege one kind of religion, that there's only one kind, and that's continuing by continuing the notion that the church doesn't have to change any of its ideologies, it doesn't have to change any of its theologies, it doesn't change anything, it just dresses up as an Indian and goes into our community. We don't need any of that. What we need is this. We need to go back to our communities and say, where in your heart and your mind and your spirit resides the teachings that you always had, that is still there, and that you want to continue to believe in, and how can we use that as a way to maximize our living together in this community and others, and then in the world. And then when we do that, we will find a way in which cognitive justice becomes a norm, not cultural imperialism and cognitive symbolism. Finally, I would just say this: nothing should be done about us without us. You do not do anything without us. That is the rule. And if you don't do anything, that silence is the shield of domination. And the other one is the most subtle yet powerful way we resist knowing is simply by being uninterested. Thank you very much.
I'm James Jenkins, and I was up here earlier today. I'm an organizer and a visionary, and I am for change. And thank you, you explained yourself very well. You know, this is why I want to establish a co-community, because change will have to come from within. I'm setting up a new organization, working with the city of Chicago to help prevent the gangs and drugs that's happening in my community. When I say my community, my race. And you're going to see a team of people in the community. A team of people that they can relate to. That team of people are the people who came from that community that are educated. Those people that came from that community that are scholars. Those people that came from that community are religious leaders, senators, judges, entrepreneurs. I'm going to convict them to help me to go into the community they come from to help empower those that were left behind. Change will have to come from us, so the world can look upon us with respect and begin to listen to us, and will join in to help solve this critical problem. We can't look from top down, but bottom up. God has blessed those in the community to become very notable, great in a society that was adverse to us, and we owe that back to the community. That was called self-respect. So I'm going to go to different churches and convict those ministers. They got all these thousands of people in the churches from that community, even outside the community that are black, to come in and help empower those that are left behind, and so from love. Love, what Jesus said, is the beginning of healing. Love. And this is what the black community needs, from my understanding, my spirituality, come from love. I'm going to say this one thing, I'm going to shut up. I'm a meditator, and I got a divine intervention. It only lasted for 4 seconds. I was walking down the street, I live in Hyde Park, and all of a sudden, there was a vision, like a feeling of divine love. Y'all heard the word called agape? It was so beautiful. I can't explain this. It's like came and left. It was divine love for those brothers and sisters that said the black community shooting up one another. My heart went out to them. It was so beautiful. It was unconditional love that I cannot even explain it. And I asked my meditating instructor, I said, okay. And he told me, he said, that is the beginning of your ministry when you're going to the community, that the people, those children, that's going to feel your love. And those who you speak to come and help you are going to feel that spirit. That's the beginning of your success of healing those people that are lost. And I'm going to say one thing, I'm a biblical scholar. I'm self-taught for 30 years. I used to study 2 hours a day. I'm very well educated in the Holy Scriptures, from the Old Testament and through Genesis to Revelation. And I found my race in the Holy Bible. I'm going to talk to the preachers. I'm going to say, before you start preaching about any other race, Find your race in the Holy Scriptures and go from there. That's when healing starts.
That's it.
And the question I ask you is that, are you in agreement with me with healing or education or what you call it, self-dignity, history, or self-existence has to come from self? Then the people from other places or other race or other society can look on and respect and begin to help teach and recognize and what we call begin to, it's called contribution to society, contribution to civilization, that people can begin to respect and honor and thrive and appreciate the race of the First Nation. What can we do?
We are a race.
I mean, a nation, I'm sorry,
We are a nation.
a nation that can contribute to society that the other race of nation that people can grow from. That contribution.
James, I appreciate your commentary. I think that all people need to understand the very basics of their own history that has never been taught to them. And for Indigenous people, we are empowered by those kinds of things, but largely when they come from within our own community. It is not something you can deliver from outside by another group of people. It has to come from them and from within and out inside as authentic ways of living and being in the world in which they live. I think that you're doing a wonderful job doing the things you are doing. Be cautious of how you address racism and race, because I think that we need to recognize race is not real. That racism is. Racialization, or how we treat people who are of different skin color, is what we do. But everyone is the same color of brown. There's nobody in any of the cultures, in any community, that hasn't got a skin color that isn't some form of brown.
I was very inspired by your work on decolonizing education when I read this a few years ago. And it made me think a lot. I'm a theologian, I teach theology, and try to see like the possibilities for decolonizing theological education along the same line you were doing with the... Now, from your experience within the university education system, what extent do you think you are succeeding in reproducing a decolonized or de-Eurocentricized education in a way that actually gives hope to the possibility of changing or transforming the system? Can you give us some sense of the successes?
Well, I think that I teach both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students, graduate level, and when students who come into my classroom, I ask them, first of all, why are you here? And invariably there will be one or two who will always say, because other students have told me that when I come out of this class, I will be changed. And that's what I do, is I want people to be changed, but I lead them through a process of understanding about all the things that they had normal in their life, that they had normal narratives in their schooling, all the things that were part of the normalized way of being is now put in question. And I give that to them through all kinds of readings and different speakers and so on. But it is to get them to realize that we have been socially constructed as Indigenous people. and that Eurocentrism has socially constructed itself as superior to everything, and that we need to unpack all of those things about itself, as well as who we are as Indigenous people. We aren't the representative traditional Indians. We are modern Indians. We are all somewhere in between, and that we need to find ourselves today in the place that we're in the situations in which we have to live in. And that is why teaching gospel, teaching scripture to Indigenous peoples has been such a difficult, I don't want to say a waste of time, but I would say almost a waste of time. Because basically what you're doing is you're putting a Christian land-based culture that came from another continent with its own prophets and leaders, and transplanting them into other places, and think that in those lands and in those places it is the same. By diffusing, universalizing concepts that don't fit in our place and time, it creates nihilism. It creates meaninglessness. And no matter if we know of people who are Christians, good, strong Christians who committed suicide. We know of all the people who have been part of our communities, who don't go to school, who haven't graduated from high school, good, solid Christians, but they are not succeeding. And we need to rethink what success means. And we need to rethink what success means in the context of the culture and the community in which we are in right now. And we need to rethink it and let people from within decide how they want to make that happen. On the way here, I met with, for 2 hours, from Saskatoon, Toronto, a woman who was getting an award in Toronto at the Indigenous Inspire. She was getting her award that night. And she told me all for 2 hours what she did and how her education system was nominated for this award. I said, my God, you've got the answer to success. You have the answer to the success in your hand, and now you are going to go teach everyone. And before we left, she said, we developed this scenario of thinking about how I might be able to help her to bring some researchers to do some sort of study on that. And before we ended up, we said, let's write a book. We'll write a book together on that. And so she said, yes, let's. And she started thinking, and we said goodbye. I gave him a card, she gave me a card, and I said, that's my next one.
Larry Martin. I introduced myself this morning. I appreciate really much of what you said about changing attitudes and education's role in that. My own focus has been very much on the land aspects, especially on. I'm sorry, I'm just not familiar with Canadian treaties, so I really have no idea how to apply this there. But where I come from in Wisconsin, Minnesota, we have Chippewa treaties that the land was ceded with the retaining of rights to hunt, fish, and gather. And these rights have been affirmed by the courts with a lot of public resistance, so there is a need for education, surely. But the last most crucial case, the Mille Lacs case, is very recent. The Chippewa treaty rights were affirmed by the Supreme Court of the United States by one vote, the Supreme Court. So it comes down really very much to what happens next Tuesday. I mean, treaty rights are crucial, So having the right people on the Supreme Court is absolutely necessary, because it's about land, it's really about land. It's about attitudes, but it's really about land. Thank you.
Right, and our treaties of peace and friendship treaties were all about giving people, making sure that our people, Mi'kmaq, Maliseets, and so on, had the rights to continue their own livelihood. and that was to hunt, the fish, and all, and the Supreme Courts have held to that. But there was never a giving over of any land anyway. You know, that is the biggest one that people have the hardest time thinking about. And oftentimes our Grand Captain who was putting this forward said, listen, we're not asking you to take your land and give it back to us. That's not what we're asking for. We're saying that the benefit that you give that country that you pay taxes to, if you had some of that tax money helping our communities to grow, we would do far better than we are doing now in terms of developing our base, our economies, and so on. And we would be able to bring back the very things that we need to thrive beside you. So it isn't about taking people's land away from them. It's about regenerating a new relationship, and that new relationship would be that the federal government and the provincial government who takes taxes off these lands are also going to have to pay and give some taxes on to the Indigenous peoples.
Marie, I appreciate much of what you said, and one thing struck me, and I think it would be important if we could, unpack that a little more. The whole phenomenon of the Indigenous Renaissance. What does that mean? What do we know? What are the case studies? What are the things that we have learned from the Indigenous Renaissance? I'm sorry, I need to say my name. I'm Steve Judd.
Hello, Steve. The Indigenous Renaissance is something that has been generated, especially in Canada, I would say, in the early 70s. Right up until the late 60s, there was the bilingual, bicultural Royal Commission that was developed in Canada, and that the two founding fathers, the English and the British, were fighting over, how much of a contribution they had made to the world by virtue of their being. And that is when the Indigenous people across Canada said, wait a minute, you're not the First Nations here, we are the First Nations here. And that's how the name First Nations came about. And so as a result of that, and our own resurgence of our own voices, our own teachings. When I went to school in 1983, I had nobody, when I graduated, with me who was Indigenous. And I was, in fact, one of the first 5 in Canada who had ever gotten a doctorate degree. My brother and I both graduated from Harvard with a master's degree, and we were among the only handful of the probably 5 of us who had ever had a master's degree in all of our nation. And so basically, we have had to go through the system on our own, but in coming out of the system, we've become much stronger activist warriors for not Eurocentric education, but more for our own sui generis, or our own one-of-a-kind education. And it is a one-of-a-kind education that we have a right to because of our treaties and Aboriginal rights. And we recognize now something, because I think we got educated, that we had been so socially blind and socially oppressed that we could never hear any other voice. And so when we then got our voice, we started to talk to people, share with people, and had a much larger number of people who said, and who have read this book, Reclaiming Indigenous Voice and Vision, was one of the first books I did, where Indigenous graduate students said to me, I was changed by reading that book, because you gave me the voice that I was always wanting to have. You gave me the reasoning. It became my theoretical foundation for my doctoral thesis, for my master's thesis, for my papers. And then my book that we wrote on protecting Indigenous knowledge and heritage was an analysis of Indigenous knowledge systems and how they had been abused and had not been protected by all the systems that were under the Eurocentric system. It's now available in Spanish. They have a master student has taken the main concepts from that and has put that into Spanish. If those who are Spanish speakers, I can send you a link to that or send you the PDF for that. But these particular pieces are things to which Indigenous scholars around the world, not just in Canada, but around the world, are putting forward a very strong face because they are graduating from Harvard, from Stanford, Penn State, from Berkeley, from all the institutions around the world now, and are saying the same thing, that our Indigenous peoples have been oppressed, that we have lived a colonial life, and that all of that does not add up to us finding in the system today a better way than the way in which what we lost. And so we have to go back to that.
Thank you, Marie, because that's been what I have felt and have experienced through Indigenous friends and colleagues around exactly what that. And I think it's a key area for us to continue to work and to celebrate, because I think that is one of the alternatives right within our reach. So thank you.
And of course, our education system is making it possible for us as we begin to talk about indigenization, indigenizing the academy. We're also doing that in all kinds of places through the Canadian Association for University Teachers, through the Universities Canada. These are all major organizations across Canada that are adopting indigenization as a rule, as a reconciliation, as a process, and we shall begin to see more and more of this activity.
I'm aware that we're out of time now, but I'm sure if you have further questions, we have a few minutes afterwards, we can stick around and talk with Marie, but I want to respect everybody's time and end on time here. Please, before I ask you to join me in thanking Marie one more time, please join us tomorrow. The conference continues, but the conference venue tomorrow is down at CTU, and we start with breakfast there for everybody who comes at 8 o'clock. So, but please join me.